Jesus Christ is the leading figure of the Christian religion, representing everything good in creation as the firstborn son of God. Lucifer, on the other hand, is generally equated with the devil in Christian mythology, an ultimate prideful evil that thought himself as being above God. Somehow, these two figures have managed to attain overlapping identities from one culture to the next, with some traditions even holding them to essentially be the same figure. In the New Testament, Jesus Christ is presented as the Son of God, sent down to the earth to die for man's sins, allowing for their salvation. But Lucifer is a bit more of a complex story. Today, the term Luciferian tradition refers to a trend in ancient mythology where different cultures had a figure that was seen as enlightening humans with knowledge. In some cases, this would be seen as evil and wrong, giving humans misleading information that leads to their doom, but in others, it was seen as positive and deserving of worship. And though it may seem easy to understand on the surface why Jesus could be seen as a positive, enlightening figure, there is interesting evidence connecting him to the Luciferian figure in many mythologies. In Judaism, the Luciferian figure has more than one symbol. The first and most obvious of these is the serpent from the Garden of Eden. In this story, God creates Adam and Eve to tend to the plants in the Garden of Eden, a paradise, but he forbids them to eat from the tree of forbidden knowledge of good and evil. The serpent then comes along and tempts Adam and Eve, leading to them consuming the fruit and being cast out of the garden with punishments. The serpent likewise is punished, being forced to crawl upon his belly on the earth. The Garden of Eden narrative isn't the only example of this Luciferian or enlightening figure in Judaism, however, and in fact, many mythologies have more than one myth about this same figure. This is because mythology itself is history cloaked in metaphor and allegory. Early mythology was written this way because there was no actual written record of events that transpired that were later considered foundational to a culture. Myths allowed entire tribes of people to be reduced to singular characters in these narratives, such as gods in the polytheistic religions, or entities such as angels, patriarchs, or even the serpent in the monotheistic tales of Judaism. Many cultures would make several attempts to write down these stories with different metaphors, some of these being written hundreds of years apart from each other. In the case of Judaism, this would result in what we now call the Book of Genesis. While the stories are lined up to be something of a linear history, evidence shows that the stories were written without regard to one another, each being a unique story that talks about the same basic conflicts of enlightenment before the Great Flood, but the serpent is the most important of these in Genesis. The compiling of these metaphorical stories didn't end with Genesis, however, and the same Luciferian figure described in the Eden narrative is also discussed in Apocrypha such as the Book of Enoch. This was one of several texts from the Second Temple period in the centuries before Christ found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Book of Enoch elaborated on the time mentioned in Genesis 6, which begins the story of Noah's Ark. Here, sons of God are described as coming down and taking human wives, which leads to the birth of beings called Nephilim, which is Hebrew for fallen ones. These figures aren't mentioned again in the story of Noah's Ark, however, which is why texts like the Book of Enoch would be written later to elaborate on them. In the Book of Enoch, these sons of God are also referred to as the Watchers, called such because they were sent down by God to watch over humans and guide them towards healthy civilizations. The Watchers, however, went to chase their own interests and chose to rebel against God by taking those human wives. This leads to the Nephilim, who are described as giants so big that they burst out of their mother's wombs. The Nephilim would go on to eat all of the food in their lands and then turn to devour the smaller humans, cannibalizing them to stay alive. The Watchers are presented very much as enlightening figures who led humans astray, and the Book of Enoch explicitly describes them as giving forbidden knowledge and magics to humans that they were not ready for, starting with their wives and children. For this, the Watchers are chained and thrown into a pit within the earth, where they will have to watch the destruction of their descendants. Even with Judaism, there is a strong equation of the Watchers, particularly their leader, with the serpent from the Book of Genesis, with the two being recognized as metaphors for the same historical figure deep in the past. In Kabbalistic texts like the Jewish Zohar, for instance, the leader of the Watchers, here called Samael, is said to have ridden into the Garden of Eden riding the serpent. He doesn't just give Eve the forbidden knowledge, however, but like the Watchers, is said to impregnate Eve, leading to the birth of her first son, Cain. Here, Cain is described as the first giant and the father of the Nephilim race. Lucifer later became the name for this leader of the fallen angels in the Christian tradition. This has its roots in the Latin Vulgate translation of Isaiah 14, which describes a Babylonian king with a poetic metaphor. Here, he is described as being a fallen figure like Hallel ben Shahar, or Dawn, son of morning. This was a term used to describe Venus, which had a reputation in the ancient world as the morning star. Venus is closer to the sun than the Earth is, and so for 9 months at a time, we see it either following the sun as it sets or coming up before the sun as it rises, based on where Venus is in its rotation around the sun. For the 9 months we see Venus rising before the sun, it is known as the morning star. In Rome, this was referred to as Lucifer, or light bringer, as it signaled the sun was about to arise. Here in Isaiah 14, Venus is described as trying to outshine God, or the sun, only to be pulled down into a pit as punishment for his pride. This appears to be a reference to the end of the 9 months where Venus orbits around the sun to make it rise in the morning. From this point on, Venus begins to loop around to the other side of the sun, making Venus only visible as it trails behind the sun as it sets for another 9 months. During this time, Venus is known as the evening star. Because the imagery of being thrown into a pit was so similar to the tale of the Watchers from the Book of Enoch, the morning star was seen as another title for the leader of the fallen angels. The name Lucifer stuck with later translations into English despite the fact that Lucifer wasn't seen as a god or a divine figure in Roman mythology, the way we might think of the goddess Venus. Instead, he was closer to a fable or fairy tale that was simply meant to help you remember the motions of the morning star. Retroactively, however, Lucifer or Luciferian would become a term used to describe all the figures that parallel or relate to the serpent in the different mythologies. In the early centuries of Christianity, other traditions involving the Christ figure would rise up and even leave us extensive texts detailing their perspective on the existence of Christ. Among these was what we now call the Gnostic tradition. In Gnostic stories like the Apocryphon of John, the Old Testament God was presented as something of an evil, ignorant architect, or demiurge as it is called in the Greek. Here, the demiurge trapped Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden as a sort of false paradise where they would be forced to worship him. The serpent is presented as something of a hero in this story, given the gift of forbidden knowledge that lets Adam and Eve escape the false Eden, and eventually the control of the demiurge as a whole, if their descendants can purify their souls and return to the divine realm above. The Apocryphon of John specifically is a revelation given to John by Jesus himself after his resurrection and ascension to heaven, where he is able to send the story as a vision. In this vision, Jesus presents himself as the one who taught Adam and Eve the forbidden knowledge against the wishes of the Old Testament God. This makes Jesus himself the Luciferian figure, or as he is portrayed in the Garden of Eden, that makes Jesus the serpent. John, of course, explains that he was taught that it was the serpent who gave forbidden knowledge to humans, and here Jesus explains that the only serpent, or deceitful one, would be the demiurge himself, who tried to keep his knowledge away from humans. Now, the Gnostics weren't just some random group of fanfiction writers who just hated God and wanted to invert his narrative while also choosing to revere the Christ figure. But the Gnostics are what we might think of as the actual religious class that existed before the Christian tradition had taken over Greece, Egypt, and Rome. Before Christianity, Greece was home to the mystery schools, these initiation-based systems that existed really all over the ancient world as far back as ancient Egypt, but which the Greeks had a special love for. The most popular of these was the Eleusinian Mysteries, which mirrored the stories of Gnosticism that weren't found in Christianity. In Gnostic tales like the Apocryphon of John, Adam and Eve and their human descendants are animated by the light of a divine entity named Sophia, Greek for wisdom. Sophia existed above the material world in some stories, or in the case of the Apocryphon of John, was actually the creator of the material world through a prideful mistake. When she falls into the material world, her light is taken by the demiurge, who doesn't realize that it is of a divine nature greater than him, from his own creator even. With this light, he animates the humans, making them the only creatures that he can truly interact with, but who ultimately yearn to escape his prison and return to the spiritual world above. Before this, the same story played out in the Eleusinian Mysteries of ancient Greece. In the initiation ceremonies for this mystery school, the candidate would play the role of the goddess Persephone, who falls into the underworld and has to be restored by her father Zeus. These mystery schools would evolve to include biblical characters as the Christian tradition spread to the various regions, but the key story would remain the same: the fall into a lower reality and the rise back up to divine realms above. and when adapting them to Christian characters, the Gnostic stories that they created would be used to teach the reader how to properly not just interpret the Bible, but their own local mythologies as well. The proper way simply being to understand the perspective of the historical peoples who wrote them. You see, in the Greek mythology, there was also what we would call a Luciferian figure. However, in this tradition, he was seen more so as a hero than a misleading trickster, like the Serpent or Lucifer is considered in Judaism. This figure is Prometheus, with the earliest account of this figure coming from Hesiod's Theogony from the 8th century before Christ, with its tradition of course having to predate this writing by some time. This genealogy of the gods presented by Hesiod is very similar to the Book of Genesis in many ways, containing elaborate genealogies but of gods and goddesses instead of patriarchs. After an account of creation and intergenerational wars among the Titans and Olympians, the story of Theogony shifts primarily to the conflict among the Olympians, particularly that between Zeus and Prometheus. Zeus and Prometheus are both Olympians who are children of two different Titans. Zeus and his siblings were the children of the Titan leader Kronos, and Prometheus was the son of Iapetus. In this new world after the Titans have been banished to Tartarus, or Hell, Zeus wants to keep the humans ignorant of certain powers, such as the knowledge of unwearying fire. Prometheus, however, favors the humans and wants them to have flourishing societies, so he steals the knowledge that Zeus specifically forbade for the humans and gives it directly to them in order to anger Zeus. Prometheus, however, is Greek for foresight, and because of this, Prometheus was said to have the gift of prophecy, to see the future. His giving forbidden knowledge to humans was something he knew would cause Zeus to punish him, with Prometheus being chained to the earth, similar to the fallen angels from the Book of Enoch. But he also foresaw that one day Zeus would forgive him and send his own divine son to set him free. Prometheus was seen by the Greeks as a pretty direct equivalent to the serpent from the Garden of Eden. This forbidden knowledge was seen as something that humans would ultimately benefit from, however, and Prometheus is portrayed as believing that it would be worth the suffering to make sure humans received it. Prometheus is such a huge figure within the Luciferian tradition that it is often just referred to as the Promethean tradition instead, with Prometheus being treated as noble or at least ambiguous compared to Lucifer, the fallen angels, or the serpent, who are all considered rather evil. The Gnostic tales, such as the Apocryphon of John, then, were written to take the Genesis narrative and make it reflect the perspective of the Greeks. Here, Zeus takes the form of the Old Testament god. It's important to remember that Zeus and his siblings had obvious parallels to the cultures around him, including the Canaanite traditions that the Israelite and later Jewish traditions would develop out of. In Greece, the father of the Olympians was Kronos, or Saturn as he was called in Rome. He had 3 sons, the most important of which being Zeus, or Jupiter, who was known as the thunder god of the sky. His 2 brothers included Hades, or Pluto, the god of the underworld, and Poseidon, or Neptune, the god of the sea. This basic family tree wasn't just Greek or Roman, but also Canaanite, where Kronos was called El, and he was the father of Baal, the god of storms, who had 2 brothers, Yam, the god of the ocean, and Mot, the god of the underworld. To the Greeks, the thunder god Zeus was the ruler of the gods, but in their own story, he took a bit of a villainous role against the people. The humans weren't created by Zeus in the Greek mythology, but instead were created by Prometheus, who himself was said to be the father of Deucalion, who himself fathered Helen, who is the father of the Hellenistic people. Prometheus himself was seen as the son of Iapetus, the Titan, who had his children with the daughter of the Ocean Titan. Prometheus thus was something of a fusion deity meant to represent the coming together of the ocean god from the west and the thunder god worshipped to the east. Or to put it another way, the Greeks saw themselves as, mythologically, descended from Prometheus and the water gods, with Zeus being the father of the Canaanites and later Jewish people, with Zeus being known there as Baal or Baal-El, the son of El. To help solidify these connections in the minds of the Greek readers in the early centuries of Christianity, the Bible even refers to its own god as El or Elohim. In Gnosticism, then, the Old Testament God takes on the role of Zeus, withholding knowledge from humans because he simply doesn't want them to have its power. Prometheus becomes the serpent, tricking humans into thinking this knowledge is for their own good, with both referred to simply as the Christ figure or Jesus. In Judaism, Jesus, interestingly, is seen as a figure somewhat like the serpent, a misleading one who gave forbidden knowledge to people that led them astray, though the serpent and Jesus aren't given a full equation with each other. Instead, in Judaism, both figures are seen as given the same forbidden information to humans. In each culture and even subculture, the forbidden knowledge in these stories can mean different things, and it's well believed that there are multiple forbidden knowledges that were given to the humans. But the most important of these in Judaism is the gift of prophecy. Prometheus himself had the gift of prophecy, and it is believed that the true forbidden knowledge of illuminating fire that he gave humans was the ability to see the future. This is mirrored in the Garden of Eden narrative itself, and really in the greater Jewish tradition. In Judaism, the gift of prophecy has two forms. First is the common kind that most any human can tap into with enough intellectual training and moral growth. However, the prophets of the Old Testament were said to be led not by this version of prophecy, but a more potent kind that can only come from the name of God. In the Old Testament Hebrew, God is often referred to by a four-lettered name that is considered forbidden to speak in the Jewish tradition. To meditate on this name was said to give the gift of prophecy, as well as other great miracles that could be performed. This name of God was kept so secret that it was considered lost to the Jewish people in 70 AD with the destruction of the Second Temple, as that was the one place that the name would be spoken on Yom Kippur as part of its rituals. Because the original Hebrew of the Bible has no vowels, certain assumptions have been made that it is pronounced Yahweh or Yehovah, but the actual pronunciation is considered lost to the Jewish people at this time. According to the Book of Enoch, the sons of God, or watchers who rebelled against God, were said to do so with the power of the name of God, which was used to bind them together in an oath. The Word of God was an actual power that the fallen angels had then, and is considered in the greater tradition to be part of the information that was passed on to the humans through the wives of the sons of God. According to the book of Genesis, people as a whole were said to start calling upon this name of God in the generation of Enos, the grandson of Adam through Seth. According to the Bible as a whole, the Nephilim children of the sons of God didn't just exist before the flood, but also after, becoming known later as the Anakim and Rephaim. In the Zohar, it is explained that they were called the Rephaim, or lax ones, because they had let go of the spiritual world above, that which requires the name of God to communicate with. While Judaism rejects Jesus as its Messiah on the surface, that doesn't mean there weren't ever writings associated with him in Judaism. Following the life of Christ and the destruction of the Second Temple, the Jewish people would be spread out to different regions of the world. With so much separation between the different Jewish communities, a desire would arise to transcribe the oral traditions of the most prominent rabbis in those different locations, in order to try and preserve it. This would lead to the Talmud, a compilation of these different commentaries on the original Jewish Torah, mostly focusing on the laws and rules presented within it and the exact ways to follow them or get around them. However, the Talmud was also used to compile certain traditions regarding the prophecies of the future, and was an attempt to fulfill the duty described in the Old Testament to seal up the prophecies they had received so that future generations would be able to understand them. With certain tractates, however, we find different references to a figure known as Yeshu, which is an obvious shortening of Yeshua, or Jesus. While there are some differences in the story of Jesus and this Yeshu, Yeshu is referred to in Sanhedrin 43a as Yeshu the Nazarene, or Jesus of Nazareth, Nazareth being the hometown of Jesus in the New Testament. Here he is said to have led Israel and the Jewish people astray. For this, Yeshu is described as being stoned and hung on the eve of Passover. The only key difference here between the story of Jesus and the story of the Talmud's Yeshu is that the Talmud describes the death as stoning instead of crucifixion, and of course in the Talmud there is no resurrection. Other versions of this story are found elsewhere in the Talmud from different rabbis, indicating that the story had its origin before the spread of Christianity and before even the spread of Judaism into its different locations. Later, different communities would write down different versions of a story called the Toledah of Yeshu, or the Generations of Yeshu. The Toledah of Yeshu is a story that has several variations, as I said, indicating that it started as an oral tradition before the separation of the Jewish communities, with each eventually writing down their own version in order to preserve the differences from the others that began to arise. The Toledah of Yeshu was found with its different variations from Africa through Europe, but they often reflected the same basic story, with details not included in the Talmud. One example of this is Jesus specifically having the word or name of God. It is through the usage of this name of God that Yeshu, or Jesus, is described as performing those very miracles described in our New Testaments, such as walking on water and even raising the dead. Here, he is still put to death for misleading people, and of course, there is no resurrection after 3 days. According to the book of John, Jesus is the Word himself come into physical form, being there with what we think of as God when creation first began. The timing of Jesus is too precise to not have significance to the Jewish ideas of the Messiah, and in fact, the more we examine the Old Testament, other Jewish sources, and even the prophecies from elsewhere in the world, we find them all pointing back to Jesus. In the Jewish tradition, the term Messiah simply means anointed one and refers to someone of great importance that is anointed or chosen by God, but not a direct son of God. The most prominent of the Old Testament prophecies regarding the Messiah comes from the book of Daniel, which was the last of the Old Testament stories to be written and compiled with the others. Unlike much of the Old Testament, which is written in Hebrew, the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic, the language of the common folk in the Second Temple period. According to this text, from the time of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, there would be 70 weeks before the Anointed One would appear. In this 70 weeks, the Jewish people are said to need to seal up prophecy for future generations, as well as repent for their sins. The 70 weeks are not considered a literal 70 weeks, but rather in Judaism, this sort of measurement can scale up and down. A week can mean 7 days then, but it can also mean 7 years, so 70 weeks here means 490 years. This decree to rebuild Jerusalem is said to happen in the 20th year of the reign of the Persian king Xerxes. This decree then would align with 445 years before Christ. 490 years later would be 45 AD, just a tad bit ahead of the supposed time that Jesus Christ died. This timing was not what inspired our Gregorian calendar, which begins to count from the life of Christ, but instead, that number just so happened to overlap with these 70 weeks from outside sources as well. According to the New Testament itself, Jesus was said to be executed under the reign of the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, who Jewish historian Josephus recorded as ruling between the years we now call 26 AD and 36 AD. And our Gregorian calendar was reverse engineered from this logic. This lines up almost perfectly with these 70 weeks by what some would call a coincidence and what others would call the proof of prophecy, with the book of Daniel saying at this time, Jesus, or an anointed one, will be cut off. From here, the prophecy of Daniel describes what the Jewish people believed to be the destruction of the Second Temple due to the invasion of a foreign ruler. However, the idea that they had a Messiah at this time is rejected. However, there is even more evidence supporting the idea of the Messianic Jesus in later Jewish texts that would follow. According to the Talmud, the world was meant to be divided into 3 eras of time, each about 2,000 years long, making a total of 6,000 years before the period where God will rule over the world. The first 2,000 were the era of chaos, the 2,000 years leading up to the Israelites being established after the return from Egypt. The next 2,000 years were meant to be the age of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. This period was said to end with the conclusion of the Mishnic period, with the final 2,000 years being the age of the coming of the Messiah. We are currently just 2 centuries away from the Jewish year 6000, the end of the Third Age. Now, despite this age being called the coming of the Messiah, there was an expectation among the Jewish people that their Messiah would come at the very beginning of this period, after the first 4,000 years of existence according to their calendar. This overlaps with the early centuries of Christianity about 2,000 years ago. As the Talmud's commentary continues in 97b, however, it is explained that this time was moved due to the Jewish people of the time not repenting for their sins. Because of this, further passages indicate that there will be a coming of a Messiah at the designated time, a final appointed period where it has to take place, whether the Jewish people repent or not. In Sanhedrin 98b, one rabbi explains that because the Jewish people failed to repent by the early period, that the prominence itself had moved to the Gentiles. Gentiles simply translates here as nations, which can refer to the Jewish people as well, depending on the context, but here is a reference to the nations outside of the Jewish people. With all of this in mind, despite Christianity being seen as a heresy by the Jewish people, it is Christianity's spread that coincides with the prominence from God moving from just the Jewish people to the nations of the earth as a whole, at the same time that their stories say that Jesus of Nazareth took the secret name of God and ensured that the Bible would become the most widely known religious text in the world. It is in these early centuries that the Gnostic schools would claim to have the name of God themselves, with texts such as the Book of You. This fascinating text details the traveling through the higher dimensions into the afterlife, where different names and words give special access to the greater realms. Throughout the text, the most powerful word is EU, with the frequent claim that EU is the one true God that will be called the God of the EUs. This name of God not all that different from how Yahweh may have been pronounced deep in the past, with reports from the Second Temple period from Greek philosophers indicating that it was pronounced more like Eo or Yao. In these texts, we get an array of prophecy and spiritual texts that line up interestingly with those in the Jewish tradition. One text, Pisti Sophia, talks about a designated time where enough souls have repented, allowing Jesus to usher in an age ruled by divine light, very similar to what is described in the Talmud for the end times. Jesus is a figure that had interesting connections to the Luciferian tradition, but on both sides of the aisle, we seem to find proof that Jesus and his father are not beings that mislead people for negative reasons, but beings that only want what is best for us. In both Greek and the Jewish traditions, the only Luciferian figure, or misleading figure, becomes the humans who have the power of God, but who refuse to do what they are meant to do with it. In the case of Prometheus, he was not supposed to share the forbidden knowledge with others, but it was something he decided would be an ultimate good for humanity, even if it came with the suffering of humans and even himself. In the Jewish tradition, Prometheus would be villainized as the Serpent and the Watchers, beings who taught forbidden knowledge to humans. Here they are portrayed as disobeying God in order to chase their own desires. When the Jewish people received the name of God, however, they were told they need to repent by the early centuries of Christianity in order to receive their Messiah, and when they didn't, they were reinterpreted as being similar to the people that Prometheus represented before them, turning the Old Testament God into a demiurge who had accidentally trapped the light of humans in the material world until the designated end time mentioned by both cultures. This is really just skimming the surface of what we can talk about in regards to Jesus and the Luciferian figure, but for more information, consider subscribing to the channel and maybe consider donating on Patreon. The more money we make there, the more money we are able to pay our editor to keep these videos coming out in a more timely fashion. Until then, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss future videos, or any of the polls we put out in the community tab where you get to help decide what kind of video we make next. See you guys then.